In 1971, at 966 Lindley Street in Bridgeport, Connecticut, married couple Jerry and Laura Goodin and their daughter Marcia started being plagued by a violent and destructive paranormal force that had taken residence in their home. Grab a coffee, this gets wild. This is the third and final part of the Bridgeport Poltergeist Incident. So, Father Doyle pulled up outside the house at 966 Lindley Street, climbed out of his car and took a long, hard look at the property, trying to get a feel for the atmosphere. You know, just taking it all in before he entered. He took a long, deep breath, rolled up his sleeves, knocked on the door, and waited for a few seconds before the door opened and Jerry Goodin invited him in. Now, the very first thing Father Doyle did once he was inside the house was sit down in the infamous recliner, the one that had thrown Marcia around like a rag doll. He tried to force the seat back without using the handle to see if it'd move on its own, but it wouldn't. He couldn't get the thing to recline at all, not without the lever. He sat back, frowned, and looked around at the police officers and firemen who were also in the room, and quietly announced that he could certainly feel a heaviness inside the house. He was absolutely convinced of it. He said there was indeed an evil presence, and it definitely wasn't happy that they were there. Then he pulled out a small vial from his pocket and started walking around systematically from room to room, blessing the home, praying and sprinkling holy water as he muttered the words out loud. When he returned to the living room, Father Doyle placed the small vial of water on the table and started to recite one last prayer. Right in the middle of this prayer, that bottle of holy water flew from the table and smashed against the wall, the contents erupting everywhere. Officer Tomek, who was also in the room, gave Father Doyle one of those nods of acknowledgement, as if to say, "See what I mean?" The two men had a brief conversation, and Father Doyle admitted that the presence residing in this house was far darker and more sinister than anything he had ever experienced, and would almost certainly require an exorcism, a practice that he had never performed. He immediately grabbed the phone and called Father Tribbo, an exorcist who was very well respected in the field. By this time, Laura had been taken to the local general hospital to have her foot properly examined. The police officers inside the house were discussing what was going on. They simply couldn't believe what they were witnessing. A few of them later even admitted that they were starting to think they were losing their minds. Some of the officers walked out of the house and simply refused to go back in, retreating to the safety of their cars. But other officers stayed inside the house, I guess out of sheer curiosity more than anything else. I mean, clearly this wasn't a criminal case. Weirdly, Marcia seemed to be thriving in the chaos. She sat with the officers, chatting, smiling, and, well, apparently enjoying the attention. The laughing and joking was interrupted by a knock at the door. Officer Tomek opened the door this time. A lady was standing on the front porch. She introduced herself to Tomek as Mary Pascarea, a close neighbour of the Goodins. You see, Mary had a keen interest in all aspects of the paranormal and said she knew a thing or two about poltergeists. She said she felt obliged to offer her services because she was convinced that this was what they were dealing with. She had attended many lectures about the paranormal, including demonic possessions and poltergeist activity. She remembered that more often than not, the activity would be focused around one particular person in the household, usually the youngest or the weakest. In this case, she thought that perhaps the presence in the house might be drawn to Marcia. Mary went back home, picked up her phone book and searched for a number she'd saved from a lecture she'd attended not long ago. That lecture had been taught by a couple, a husband and wife team who had earned themselves quite a reputation in dealing with situations like the one the Goodins had found themselves in. Their names? Well, you might have already guessed, Ed and Lorraine Warren. The Warrens pulled up at the property with a priest they'd worked with on previous cases, Father William Charbonneau, more commonly referred to as Father Bill. Also accompanying the Warrens and Father Bill was a 21-year-old seminary student named Paul Eno. At this point, Jerry and Laura had never even heard of the Warrens, but when Laura returned from the hospital, she was simply relieved that someone with some real experience of dealing with these situations was actually taking them seriously. Ed Warren pulled Paul to one side and quietly requested for him to keep a very watchful eye on Marcia the entire time. In Ed's experience, children were always the ones to watch in poltergeist cases. This was because they were either faking it for attention or they were the primary focus of the poltergeist itself. After seeing Marcia head down to the basement with 2 police officers, Paul decided to follow closely behind. Now he was surprised to hear these 2 police officers gently trying to coax a confession out of little Marcia, trying to get her to admit that she was behind the whole thing. I can only presume that these 2 officers hadn't witnessed the activity for themselves without Marcia present. Meanwhile, upstairs, the circus rolled on. One of the police officers handed Ed Warren the phone to speak with Police Superintendent Joseph Walsh, who was absolutely furious at how much manpower was being sucked into all this nonsense. Back in the living room, once again Marcia was sitting in her favourite recliner, and once again the chair lifted, but this time it rose up in the air, levitating completely off the floor with Marcia still sitting in it. Then the chair crashed back down to the ground, throwing Marcia forward, smacking her head on the floor in the process. Those officers who had just been accusing Marcia of some kind of hoax had just witnessed her being thrown from a recliner as it hovered in the air. They stood there with their mouths completely agape, in shock, and I hope they felt very fucking guilty for doubting her. The seat was so heavy, in fact, it took both of these men to get it back upright. 2 men, and yet that chair had just floated in the air with nobody touching it at all. All around them, things toppled from shelves, photo frames and ornaments smashed to the ground. There was loud bangs and knocks on the doors and walls, accompanied by the familiar sound of heavy footsteps, which reverberated through the entire house. A team of plumbing inspectors arrived at the property to check for air in the pipes, which could definitely have been the cause for the knocking. I know personally I've heard knocking sounds coming from the air in my pipes at home, so that's totally possible. Or maybe I have a poltergeist too. But guess what? They could find no faults either. No air in the pipes, no leaky radiators, and no problems with the boiler. They did, however, stay just long enough to see the refrigerator slide a full 6 feet across the kitchen floor. One of the on-duty police officers turned to the plumbers and muttered, I'm going to try and do an American accent now. Leave now, and whatever you do, don't speak about what you just saw to anyone. This is a police matter. By mid-afternoon, exhausted and at a loss, the police began to peel away. Officer Tomek stayed behind. Now the house was quieter, he saw this as his opportunity to slip into Marcia's bedroom alone. He had an idea and decided to run a test. He stood there, quite obviously scared shitless, his heart pounding in his chest, and said quietly to the empty room, If there is anyone in this room, if you can hear me, move something. Not even a second had passed when multiple items in the room began to shake. That was the moment that Officer Tomek knew. He couldn't just explain this away with some logical, rational explanation. He had just witnessed the poltergeist performing on request. However, he was also well aware that publicly declaring that he had just witnessed paranormal activity in this house might very well spend the end of his career. And for some reason, he kept that story to himself for almost 40 years. While the police were trying to make sense of the unexplainable and Father Bill was performing blessings, Ed Warren was making phone calls, a lot of them. Unbeknown to the Goodins, Ed had spent the afternoon ringing up every news outlet that would listen. Local, national, it didn't matter. If they were willing to listen, he was willing to tell the story. And by 4 p.m. that afternoon, news vans had started to arrive. Crews set up outside the house with cameras, tripods, boom mics, all jostling for space. Before long, the story had gone national, running on every news broadcast across the country. And inevitably, with the media, came even more neighbours. What had started as a few curious bystanders had swelled into over 2,000 people lining Lindley Street. Some reports claimed it eventually reached as many as 10,000 people. And to be fair, if I lived on that street and thousands of people turned up, probably blocking the road, maybe even blocking access to neighbouring properties, I'd be fucking pissed. I mean, this was ridiculous. People bought lawn chairs, cameras, radios, some even bought popcorn for fuck's sake. The whole street became a surreal block party built around one haunted house. and the rumours were pure fuel that was just adding to the fire. The Goodins felt like they were now trapped inside their own home, like their own haunted prison. But the Warrens quietly slipped away that evening. Job done, apparently. Ed Warren had stirred the pot just enough to let the hysteria take on a life of its own. But just because the Warrens had left, that didn't mean the house was finished with the Goodins. Later that night, fireman Paul McKenna returned, this time bringing 3 of his teenage stepsons. They hadn't believed a word he'd told them about what had happened in the house earlier that day. So he brought them to see for themselves. And, well, let's just say, they arrived at 966 Lindley Street as skeptics, making a mockery at the suggestion of a haunted house. But the questionable stains in their underwear would suggest that they left the house as believers in the supernatural. They watched televisions fall from their stands with nobody near them. Cans of food rolled down the basement stairs, clattering on each step like something out of a horror film. Kitchen drawers opened and slammed shut with no interference. The whole house was alive with poltergeist activity. McKenna and his sons left the house while they still could. By this point, picking things up had just become pointless. Seriously, there was no point. Something fell from a shelf, someone would pick it up, place it back on the shelf, turn around, and the thing would be straight back on the floor. Honestly, it was like the poltergeist was just taking the piss out of them. The next evening, the Warrens returned along with Father Bill and Paulino. And thanks to the Warrens, by now, the whole world was watching. By now, the story had gone global, making international headlines, a fact that, if we're honest, probably thrilled the Warrens. At first, Jerry and Laura allowed reporters inside. If it meant they would receive help, the more reporters and journalists, the better. They were really just grateful someone cared. But that all changed when a journalist spotted an old Catholic prayer book on a shelf and, in a moment of peak tabloid deceit, used the prayer book to spin a story that the Goodins were dabbling in the occult. And thanks to this scumbag journalist, within just hours, headlines were actually implying that 10-year-old Marcia was practicing witchcraft and dark magic. Now, whether or not the public were actually buying into this shit was another matter completely. Back inside the house, things were going from bad to worse. While the Warrens and Father Bill sat discussing the previous night's chaos with Jerry and Laura, Marcia, who was seated back in her favourite recliner, started fiddling with the handle. Again and again she would lean back, forcing the chair into a reclined position, as if trying to reenact the levitation from the day before. Feeling like her anxiety was about to tip over the edge, Laura turned to Marcia and snapped,
"Stop messing around with that recliner."
It should be duly noted that this wasn't the only time Marcia was caught playing with the situation. That morning, the usual activity continued. Items fell to the floor, including the shower rail again. But one thing had started to change. For the first time since the haunting began, the line between what was genuine and what was faked, for want of a better word, was now starting to blur. Father Bill and the Warrens found Marcia downstairs later on, just sitting quietly on her own with her cat in the basement. She definitely seemed to prefer hiding away down there when the house got too crowded, almost like that was where she could momentarily escape from all the chaos. They started talking to Marcia, asking her questions about how she was feeling, etc. You know, the usual chit-chat bullshit, when suddenly, in the middle of their conversation, all the basement lights cut out. Marcia huffed as if this was a regular occurrence, got up off the floor, calmly walked up the stairs, flicked the light switch a few times, and before they knew it, the power came back on. But just as she returned to the group, a metal rod suddenly launched itself out from under a pile of tools. It shot across the room like it had been fired from a cannon. I mean, this thing quite literally missed Father Bill's head by inches. Fortunately, nobody was hurt, but it could very easily have been a very different story. Nobody was anywhere near those tools, and if that was me, if I was in Father Bill's shoes, I think I would have taken that as my cue to leave, and recommend to the Goodins that they do the same. Clearly, this is not a safe environment to be raising a young girl. Shortly after that, Marcia headed back upstairs. That's when Ed Warren claimed, with a straight face, that he heard the family cat say jingle bells. Now, in all fairness, multiple witnesses had claimed they'd heard the cat talk. But, and this is a big but, Marcia had developed a bit of a habit of holding the cat up and faking its voice like some kind of ventriloquist. So, how many of those accounts were real? How many were exaggerated or just misunderstood? Well, it's impossible to say for certain, but I would eat my socks if anyone genuinely heard that cat speak. I mean, there's ghosts, there's hauntings, poltergeist activity, demonic possessions, etc. And then there's cats talking. And I think that might just be where I draw the line. I just can't take any suggestion of talking cats seriously, but that's just my opinion. Others, including people in the crowd that was gathering outside, claimed they'd heard guttural voices coming from inside the house. And if you thought talking cats was far-fetched, check this out. And I actually considered just deleting this next bit. Some of the visitors even claimed that they heard voices coming from the ceramic swans in the garden. See, I told you it was crazy, but that's what they said. Not long after the incident with the metal rod down in the basement, Lorraine Warren walked into the Goodin's kitchen and paused for a second. Now, Paulino, who was already in the kitchen, said that Lorraine's face went as white as paper. She held her hand up to her chest and gulped. She said she felt like she was about to vomit. But then, Paul noticed something else. A burn wound had started to manifest on Lorraine's wrist, blistering and festering. Paul shouted Ed to come and take a look. The hairs on Ed's arm stood on end when he saw the burns. He was truly horrified and pleaded with Lorraine to leave the house. He was genuinely concerned for Lorraine's well-being. Whatever had caused that burn, it was legit. There was no way Lorraine could have faked it. Could she? Jerry and Laura saw it with their own eyes. The blister was very real. It just appeared completely out of the blue, and it was like it was getting worse by the second. The Warrens didn't go home that night. They stayed at Lindley Street so everyone could sit together and watch the house being featured on the 11 o'clock news. As the anchors talked about America's strangest haunting, the activity inside the house was as consistent as ever. Furniture shifted around as if it had a life of its own. And yet, again, one of the televisions toppled and landed squarely on Paul Eno's leg, opening a significant gash. Ed had well and truly drilled it into him. With cases of hauntings like this, children were often either the source of the activity, implying that the whole thing was a fabrication or an elaborate hoax, or in genuine hauntings, they were the target. But Paul never left Marcia's side throughout the entire ordeal, so he knew that she hadn't been faking anything. He started to genuinely worry about Marcia. He was well aware that in situations like this, it was a very real possibility that the entity in the house might try to possess her. Father Bill and Ed Warren established communication with the church to request an exorcism. But, as with so many other high-profile cases, the church hesitated. Whether it is because they weren't convinced or because the whole thing had become such a public circus, no one knows. Either way, no one from the church was rushing to help. Meanwhile, real life didn't just pause because the Goodins' home had turned into a paranormal attraction. On Monday morning, when Jerry attended work, his colleagues didn't offer sympathy. In fact, it was quite the opposite. They ridiculed him, accused him of making the whole thing up for attention, possibly even financial gain. A local reporter from the Bridgeport Post showed up at the house, and after some initial hesitation, which is understandable given the circumstances, the family were coming under real scrutiny over the whole thing, and wild accusations were rife. Anyway, eventually the Goodins let him in, and he didn't have to wait long for the poltergeist to start performing its usual tricks. They entered the kitchen, and the very second they started to discuss the recent events, the dish rack on the counter slid towards the reporter, and then it launched itself straight at Jerry. Let's rephrase that. We all know dish racks don't just slide or launch themselves. The poltergeist launched the dish rack at Jerry. I'm just imagining the poltergeist standing in the kitchen listening to their conversation, thinking, you want a show? I'll give you a fucking show. Let's just say it didn't take long for that reporter to show himself to the door. Later that afternoon, something happened that rattled even the hardened skeptics. Laura and Marcia were sitting in the living room with Paul playing Monopoly, laughing and joking about how Marcia was cheating. Their game was interrupted when what they could only describe as a kind of yellowy mist started to form around them. At first it was just like a shapeless haze like a fog, but then it started to twist and morph over the space of about 30 seconds when eventually it manifested into something truly terrifying. The vague outlines of 4 human figures stood before them as the rancid smell of sulphur started to fill the entire room. At that very moment, Jerry walked in with how would you explain it, like a glazed over stoic expression on his face. Then, in a voice that sounded completely different to his own, he began chanting and singing in Latin. This was something he hadn't done since he was a boy, an altar boy, 40 years earlier. Marcia burst into tears and clung to Paul's waist, while he prayed with Jerry, trying his very best to coax him out of this trance-like state, so to speak. He later said he could feel the entities getting angry, like the energy in the entire house was shifting, growing darker, more ominous. When one of these mist-like figures brushed past him, he was shocked. It was nothing like he expected, like it had actual substance. It was like a physical being. He described it as a bony, scrawny, bird-like structure, even though the thing was nothing but a smoky outline. And then, with no warning whatsoever, one of these entities apparently lifted Marcia up off the ground and launched her straight across the room. Paul shouted for everyone to get out. They bolted into the rainy afternoon and straight into a sea of confused onlookers. That night, Father Bill returned with the Warrens to try another blessing. Down in the basement, Marcia's usual hiding place, they claimed they saw a black shadow figure in the corner, and they swore it had horn-like stubs on its head. They decided not to tell the Goodins, and still Ed kept encouraging members of the press to visit the house. By 9:45 p.m. that day, 2 radio reporters, Tim and Bob from WNAB, knocked on the door. The activity didn't start up again until midnight. First, a table flipped over onto its side in the living room, while the reporters were in the kitchen. Then, once again, Marcia was sitting in the recliner when it suddenly snapped back and forward with such force, the reporters agreed she couldn't possibly have done it herself. When the recliner finally fell still, she stood up. And then, in front of everyone, she was thrown backwards across the room, slamming her back into the wall with some considerable force. The temperature in the house had dropped significantly. The poltergeist activity was now completely out of control. Marcia, who was now just about near breaking point, begged her parents, she was literally pleading with them to take her somewhere else. Now personally, if that was my daughter, we would have left that house a long time ago. Tim and Bob left just after 1 a.m, feeling conflicted. They'd come to cover a novelty story. They left with empathy for a family that they couldn't explain. When Father Bill left that night, he offered to bless the police officers stationed outside to keep anything from following them home. They all accepted, all except from Officer Frank Del Toro, who was convinced that the entire thing was just a hoax. Coincidentally, he was one of the only officers who had never actually seen any of the poltergeist activity for himself. Back at the station, Superintendent Walsh had had enough. After days of chaos on Lindley Street, blocked roads, massive crowds, national press swarming a residential street, he decided it was time to shut it all down. The very next night, Officer Mike Costello, who had been assigned to crowd control, was approached by Jerry Goodin. Jerry looked shaken. The living room had been torn apart again. There was glass everywhere. While surveying the damage, Officer Costello saw something that changed everything. Marcia was sitting in the infamous recliner, and he watched her pushing it back and forth herself. Laura snapped at her to stop messing around. Moments later, another crash came from the bathroom. A bottle or something had fallen. Costello's suspicion was growing. 2 more officers arrived along with Officer Frank Del Toro, the skeptic who had previously refused to be blessed. As they talked in the living room, Costello caught Marcia again, this time slyly pushing the television with her foot. It nudged forward a few inches and tapped Jerry's leg. Jerry hadn't seen her do it. Del Toro pulled Marcia aside, and that is when she confessed. She told him she'd moved the TV, pretended the cat could talk, opened the refrigerator door the night before. I mean, she was obviously really upset, she was in floods of tears, but she was also very clear about what she was saying. She also said something else that had alarm bells ringing. She said that she'd seen Lorraine Warren burn her own wrist by holding it under hot water. The same wrist Ed later claimed had been scorched by evil energy. Marcia insisted that her parents hadn't put her up to any of this, and when asked why she'd done it, she said,
"I just wanted to see if the demon would do anything."
It was over. The officers reported back to the station. The entire thing had been a hoax. Or, at least, that's how it would be sold. The official line was that the Warrens had stoked the fire, showing up to save the day and boost their own reputation, and that Marcia, a lonely 10-year-old girl, had taken it further than anyone expected. Shortly after, Inspector Philip Clark arrived at the scene. He spoke to everyone for a few minutes, then gave a verdict. Case closed. It had all just been an elaborate hoax. He also suggested Marcia be sent to a psychiatric facility, which she was, but she was very quickly released. No diagnosis, no mental illness, just a lonely little girl in a very strange house. The Goodins were devastated. They didn't believe Marcia had caused anything. Not the bangs on the walls, not the flying furniture, not the yellow mist, not Jerry speaking Latin in a voice that didn't sound like his own. They were truly heartbroken that the entire story was now being dismissed. And their heartbreak turned into frustration, which then turned into anger. Especially when they found out that Ed Warren had been making long-distance collect calls to news outlets from their landline. But the final straw was that story about Lorraine's burn. The Goodins felt really betrayed by the Warrens and cut all contact with them immediately. And let's be brutally honest, the Goodins aren't the only family who called on the Warrens for help, but felt like the Warrens were either only in it for their own egos, their own financial gain, or they just angered the entity and made the whole situation a lot worse. Even Paul Eno, who had been deeply attached to Marcia and felt like he'd really tried his best to protect her, rushed to the house and was turned away at the door. Laura and Jerry didn't want to see anyone who was associated with the Warrens, and I can't say I blame them. Superintendent Walsh stood before the press and made it official.
There are no ghosts in Bridgeport. The Goodins were victims of the power of suggestion. Hell, even some of my own men were taken in.
Then, flatly, he added,
Ed Warren should stay out of Bridgeport.
After the headlines declared it a hoax, Jerry Goodin tried to defend his daughter. So did several of the police officers who had been in that house. They pointed out the obvious, that Marcia wasn't even in the room for some of the events that they had witnessed, that no 10-year-old girl could have done half of what they had seen. But the press, they didn't care, and neither did the crowd. In fact, things only got worse. The mob outside the house grew more aggressive. At one point, the Goodins had to physically carry Marcia through the crowd, running just to get her to her mental health appointments safely. And yet, even with the world calling it fake, the activity didn't stop. That Thursday, Thanksgiving, the family spent a day away from the house. A break, a breather. But when they returned home that evening, inside the house looked like it had been completely trashed again. And later that night, Jerry smelt smoke. He searched the house, but found nothing. So he stepped outside and told the on-duty police officer. It turns out a group of local men had been trying to set the house on fire, with the family still inside. When the men were arrested, they said they were trying to cleanse the neighbourhood, to get rid of the evil that had been brought to their street. Fucking idiots. By December, the press had mostly left, and so had the worst of the crowd. But police were still posted nearby. and some of the new officers became witnesses themselves. On the 10th of December, more officers entered the house, and they also reported seeing multiple objects move entirely on their own. But little Marcia, the little girl who had created this whole elaborate hoax, wasn't even home at the time. 4 days later, on December 14th, the Goodins came back from another night with family to find their house completely trashed once again. And Jerry had had enough. That year, he cemented the Christmas tree into a bucket to keep it from tipping over. He started wiring large items to the wall so they couldn't fly off on their own. The family was exhausted, shaken, and disillusioned. But they weren't alone. Father Doyle had continued checking in with them, offering support wherever he could, long after the church had turned its back. And then, on Monday the 16th of December, a new voice reached out. Boyce Beatty claimed to have experience in dealing with poltergeists. The Goodins didn't ask too many questions. They were barely sleeping now, and they were constantly leaving the house for fear of their own safety. At this point, they were just desperate and willing to welcome anyone who said they might be able to help. On the 18th of December, Boyce Beatty arrived at the Goodins bungalow, bringing with him Jerry Solovin and Keith Herreri from the Psychical Research Foundation. I'm sure I've probably just butchered their names. Unlike the Warrens, these three weren't there for headlines. They wanted data. They wanted a real investigation. They were surprised at how accommodating the Bridgeport police were. Records were open to them. Police officers who'd witnessed phenomena themselves gave interviews. Many were angry that the case had been officially branded a hoax. They'd seen too much. Within their first couple of weeks at the property, the investigators saw it too. The kitchen table flipping over on its own, items falling off walls, the sound of heavy footsteps in empty rooms. They interviewed witness after witness for hours, compiling one of the most detailed case files in the history of American hauntings. On the eve of their departure, Boyce and Father Bill, who'd been welcomed back by the Goodins, sat with Laura and Jerry to talk about what they'd found. They suggested the family get counselling, not to dismiss them, but to help them recover from what they'd endured. Initially, Laura was offended by the suggestion. To her, it just felt like another underhanded way of saying hoax. But Boyce made it very clear that that wasn't what he was saying at all. Look, Laura, trust me. If I thought for 1 second that this was a hoax, I wouldn't be here. Laura and Jerry said that they were leaving the property as soon as the investigation ended. Weeks of unexplainable events and thousands of dollars in damage had broken them, mentally, emotionally, and financially. But Father Bill warned the Goodins that there was every chance whatever was haunting them might very well follow them to a new house. Then Boyce and Father Bill raised the hardest truth of all. They certainly didn't believe Marcia was faking everything, but they did believe she was at the centre of it, the focus of the haunting, even if unintentionally. Whatever the explanation, the Goodins weren't cashing in. They were left with ridicule, damage, and a wrecked reputation. They were met with hostility every time they walked out into the street. They even hired a lawyer, not to get money, but to try to clear Marcia's name. The lawyer told them they could profit from interviews, but they refused. Jerry did one free radio interview to defend his daughter, and then the family went silent. They told the Warrens that under no circumstances did they have permission to use the case in their lectures. Their lawyer even billed Ed Warren for the long-distance calls he'd made from their phone. Eventually, the Goodins placed the house up for sale, but understandably, under the bizarre circumstances, no buyers came forward, and so they stayed. Marcia grew up, refused to talk about Lindley Street, and then, when she turned 18, she returned to Canada to find her birth parents. Laura died in a car crash on the 11th of June 1993, aged 68, and Jerry passed away on the 24th of September 1997, aged 78. Marcia faded from public view, but according to reports, she died in Canada at the age of 51. And that's the Bridgeport Poltergeist case. It's such a sad story, really, from start to finish. I just can't help but feel genuinely sympathetic with everyone involved. From the Goodins losing their first child to Marcia being abused and neglected in her birth home, not to mention the violent and disturbing events of the haunting itself. And then, of course, to be accused of fabricating the whole thing as a hoax, being ostracised by their community, and being used by the Warrens, so to speak. And then, after raising Marcia as their own daughter for all those years, at 18 she just decides to get up and leave. The Goodins must have been truly heartbroken all over again. It's just a really, really sad story. I don't believe that Marcia had been behind the whole thing. For me, too many people had witnessed the activity when Marcia wasn't even there. Talking cats and ceramic swans, no. That's not something I buy into, and sure, maybe Marcia was enjoying the attention and played up to the crowd. But there was something in that house, and it seemed to be thriving on the negative energy. But what do you think? What do you believe happened in that small house on Lindley Street? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And that's all from me. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'm your host, Severed Soul.